Okay, thanks. Well, many apologies to those of you in the audience as I had someone lined up to help do this little hookup to YouTube. This is just so those in the audience of you know, this is the webinar on the place of freedom of religion in the development agenda of ASEAN. And I have to note at the beginning that the webinar is sponsored by SEAFoRB, Southeast Asia Freedom of Religion or Belief Network. My name is Cole Durham, and I am the founding director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. Eugene Yap, who is also with us, and he is representing the Religious Freedom Institute. This event is part of a series, but let me just say at the beginning, those of you who are involved will be able to submit questions during the webinar using the Q&A function that should be appearing at the bottom of your screen. This will also be accessible via YouTube, but it's actually better to, we set up that because we were worried that we might exhaust capacity, but it doesn't appear to be the case. We're worried about that, and you're better off to be in things during through YouTube. I'm going to try and close the YouTube channel because it's going out on a I'm not going to close it, but it's a little distracting to watch it because there's a 5-second delay or something like that. In any event, welcome to all of you who have decided to join us. We're looking forward very much to this presentation. It is accessible live on YouTube video. There is a link. Unfortunately, I don't know how to give it to you because it's on an email on a different computer. I don't, and my assistant person who was supposed to help me is not here. So if we get that link, but if you're connected to this, you do not need the YouTube link. So that you may be interested to know, this will be recorded later, so you can access the YouTube channel. And with luck, we'll have someone who can help get that in the chat space. So with those initial bits of distraction, for which I apologize, let me just begin by saying, first I wanted to give you a little bit of background for those of you who are not familiar with the SEAFoRB network. That network was originally organized by a number of NGOs, including the Boat People SOS, the Forum Asia, the International Commission of Jurists. It was really encouraged by the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief. And in the initial meeting held about 5 years ago, the conference participants signed the Bangkok Declaration on Guiding Principles for Promoting FORB in the region, FORB being the, as most of you would know, the abbreviation for freedom of religion or belief. Since then, the conference, the SEAFoRB network has organized conferences annually that look at various issues on freedom of religion or belief in the Southeast Asian area. This year, because of the COVID virus, it was not possible to do our annual conference. So instead, we have done a series of webinars. Many of you have been at the earlier ones. There was one on peace building and conflict resolution across interreligious lines in September, a second one on coronavirus and its impact on human rights and FORB that was held in October, sponsored by the ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights in cooperation with the International Panel of Parliamentarians and the Stephanos Alliance in Norway. And today we will be talking about the place of religious freedom in the development agenda of ASEAN. As you know from the flyer that we sent out about this, the webinar will explore practical ways that freedom of religion or belief helps cultivate a social and regulatory environment that allows individuals and communities to facilitate the achievement of various social goods. We have a very distinguished panel to talk with us and speak with us about this. The plan is that they will each be given a 5 to 10 minutes for an initial statement and framing of the issues. Then I will ask a series of questions that will raise some of the important questions in this area. And then those of you in the audience will be able to submit questions through the Q&A function that is on the bottom of your screens. I'm sure most of you are familiar with how to do that. So let me introduce the people here. First, let me mention that with me as a co-organizer is Eugene Yap from Malaysia. And he will be the moderator and is the key organizer of next week's webinar. He is a prominent NGO leader and religious leader as well. And we're grateful to have him on board with us tonight. Our speakers tonight, I'm not going to go into great detail because you would have had the bios on the flyer that was sent to you in advance. But let me just say a few words. We'll be hearing first from Catherine Marshall. She is, to my mind, one of the premier experts on religion and development on earth. I don't want to disclose how many years of experience she has had, but it's massive. She was at the World Bank when the World Bank really started paying attention to issues of religion and development. And between 2000 and 2006, she was really one of the pioneers of thinking about religion and development and has continued to do that. She's now senior fellow at the Berkeley Center at Georgetown, where she continues to work on these areas. I'm extremely grateful to her as the vice president of the G20 Interfaith Forum Association. I'm the president, but she is I would say the dominant force. I mean, the much appreciated someone who really knows everyone and has an incredible wealth of ideas. So we'll be very fortunate to hear from her. Then we'll listen to Brian Grimm. Brian is probably known to you. You might not know his name, but you certainly know the statistics from his day at the Pew Forum for Religion and Public Life, when he was really one of the pioneers in developing some of the best global statistics that we have on freedom of religion and belief. I often refer to these statistics in his honor as the Grimm statistics, both because they are indeed grim, showing that something like 75% of the people on earth live in overly restrictive environments, but also because they're named after him, and he was such an important pioneer in developing them. While he remains wedded to his name, he has turned away from some of the more grim things in this area and has really moved to focus on ways that religion and business, the entire business sector, can promote freedom of religion or belief, ways that religion is good for business, ways that business can be good. And he has displayed remarkable creativity in recognizing ways that people in the business sector can really make a difference. So he is the founder and president of the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, and I'm sure he'll tell us a little bit more about that. And then finally, it's a special honor for us to have Alisa Waheed with us. Again, she is someone in this part of the world who needs no introduction, but she is a trained psychologist. She is well known for her work on family resilience issues, especially for the Muslim community of Nahdlatul Ulama, Indonesia's largest faith-based organization. She's also well known for her work on democracy, diversity, and empowerment through the Gus Durian Network Indonesia. And she, particularly relevant to our theme this evening, she serves as Indonesia's SDG ambassador, that's Sustainable Development Goal ambassador, for the Ministry of Planning and Development. So without more, let me turn things over to Catherine.
Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, as we say these days. It's dark and evening here in Washington, D.C., where I'm speaking from. I thought I would give a little bit of an introduction of some of my own journey and the way that I have seen the issues before us over the years. And then if I have enough time, comment a little bit on how we're seeing these questions unfolding in the era of COVID. I worked for many years, as Cole politely mentioned, in the World Bank. It was really 35 years, and most of those years were as an operational person, including some years working on East Asia during the East Asia crisis. And one comment that I have had to reflect on is that in my years, probably working on maybe 50 country strategies, 60, many different country discussions, at no point in any of those discussions about development strategies was religious freedom or freedom of religion or belief ever mentioned in any way. I was then drafted by the president of the World Bank, Jim Wolfensohn, to work on an initiative to try to build some bridges between the worlds of development and religion. And I think that now what we're seeing is three interrelated issues. And I think the relationships among them are very critical for talking and thinking about the links to the global agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, and all aspects of it. So the first one, clearly, which we're talking about today, is the human right to freedom of religion or belief, which has both its positive sides, the guarantee of freedom, but also, sadly, and again, Cole alluded to it, the fact that violations of religious freedom are very common, and by all the indicators that we have, are actually getting worse worldwide. So that is the question of sort of religious freedom as a specific human right. The second issue, and the question is how the two are related, is religious engagement, which basically means having religious voices and ideas at the table, having religious groups that work on health or education, on agriculture, land tenure, domestic violence, a whole host of different issues, having knowledge about them, engaging them in the development agenda, which of course, as I'm sure we all appreciate, development now is pretty much everything. There are very few issues that do not in some way fall into the development agenda. And then the third issue is literacy. And so we talk sometimes about religious literacy, which is a difficult to define term of hoping that diplomats and development professionals will have enough understanding of the very complex and diverse role of religions that they will be able to have intelligent, thoughtful conversations. And there, I think we deal with the fact that there are so many preconceptions as well as misconceptions about what is involved. And trying to define in a very practical way, which I think is a task for Asean, for universities, for all of us in many ways, trying to establish what are the standards of literacy that we expect. And frankly, within religious communities, what are the standards of understanding of development issues that are necessary in order to have a meaningful and a productive engagement. So those three issues, first of all, the basic questions of human rights, which have all their complexities. I've just come out with a paper which is called Nagging Debates, because there are so many issues around religious freedom that are really not very clearly defined. What does it mean? For example, the ability to change your religion, where the limits of freedom of speech versus respect are being tested in different parts of the world now. So the issues of these human rights. Secondly, how do we move towards religious engagement, towards getting past the walls of separation that have kept these communities often at arm's length? And I think that's been true, as I understand it, over the years for Asean, but a number of other organizations. And then third, how do we move towards the levels of knowledge and understanding that will make it easier, more productive, so that the two communities, which, and this is sort of the underlying assumption, that these are the two communities, religion and development, who really care about those who are left behind, who care about the preferential option for the poor, who care about raising the standards of living, but also standards of happiness. How you bring those communities which have not worked together in history, how do you bring them more closely together? So I'll very quickly mention that I think the COVID emergencies, and we call them emergencies because of course there's the public health, but there also are the impacts of the shutdowns in terms of the economic impact, but also the social impact, the issues of domestic violence that have been reported in so many countries, but mental illness, depression, hunger. People talk about COVID, which is hunger, people dying of hunger rather than of the disease. And it's quite remarkable how much more visible religious actors, religious communities have been in this pandemic than in previous pandemics. And that is partly because in a time sequence, the Korean church, the Tablighi, some other examples of religious communities that were responsible for spreading large parts of the disease have made religious gatherings a particularly visible part. And in a number of countries, the closing of churches, the closing of places of worship, of pilgrimages, etc., in the effort to curtail the spread of COVID, have raised many questions about the authority of states and the rights of the religious communities to be involved in that decision-making process. So in a number of countries, one speculation is that there will be a rethinking of relationships between religious and non-religious organizations with the state that will grow out of the experiences that we're living now. There also have been changes in practice, including fundraising, including specific practices, some of them involving tensions. There, the funeral practices are the most obvious example, but there are a number of others. And then what we find from a development perspective, perhaps the most interesting, is the mobilization, particularly at local levels, which you're seeing in countless countries: Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Myanmar, Cambodia, of local communities, many of them religious, but often working with non-religious communities to support vulnerable communities. In other words, providing the social safety nets, the social protection, which is still quite weak in a number of Asian countries. So that's a third area. A fourth area that's significant, and that again varies quite a bit from place to place, but it's not insignificant in the East Asia region, is the rise, which has happened in every pandemic in history, of discrimination, scapegoating, targeting of certain communities that are blamed for the spread of the disease. So the challenge and the need to deal with those communities is very much on people's minds. And fifth area that we're looking at, we're tracking this, by the way, from the Berkeley Center on a daily basis, what's happening, the faith responses to COVID. What we're concerned about is what's happening with conflicts and how the COVID pandemic and the emergencies are affecting specific conflicts that are taking place in areas. And the answer seems to be that it's complicated and it varies, with some areas where it's very clear that this is exacerbating existing tensions, that rebels, for example, are taking advantage of the crisis to take new actions. But in others, we're hopeful that the sense of common humanity, which we all talk about, will actually translate into action. Very final comment. We are all hoping that the lessons from what we're living through now will lead us to a better world, that will lead us to, as they say, build back better, build back greener, build back fairer, build back whatever it is that we want. And I think we should be thinking and talking about what kind of processes might help us to do more than talk about it, but actually translate that into action. So thank you.
So thank you very much. I think it was very nice to have the three issues illustrated through various phases of your life. I think that gave things a kind of concreteness that's very helpful and really underscores just the phenomenal breadth of the issues we're dealing with here and the tremendous impact they have on preventing people being left behind. Let's shift now to Brian Grimm, and let me turn the time to you.
Well, thanks. Great to be with everybody. I'm also calling in from the Washington, D.C. area. But I think I can share a screenshot. If I can, there you can see my desktop from Thailand. That's a few years ago. I was a little bit younger then. My wife hasn't aged since then. But just to give you a shot that this is what I see every day. So I'm always thinking of ASEAN countries, and I have 13 grandkids, and this is their favorite picture, you know, when they come into my office and here they see grandma and grandpa on an elephant. So just a little fun way to start. So one of the things I'd like to I could say the main point I'd like to make is when you think of religion and you think of faith and you think of business, what comes to mind? So for most people, especially in the NGO world, the main thing will be either one, that they violate human rights, or they pollute, or they do things like that. Or the other thing that might come to mind is, well, maybe they can donate and support our causes. You know, those are sort of the two general ideas. But I've found that within the business world, they really are a powerful ally for advancing interfaith understanding, religious freedom, and peace, which is, of course, one of the most important strategic development goals, because without peace, many of the other things can't happen. So I'd like to give a couple examples and share a little bit about what some of the folks I know in the ASEAN region are doing. And one of the most powerful examples comes from Indonesia. The head of the UN Global Compact, which for the Indonesian network, which is if you're not familiar with that, the Global Compact is the association of businesses, top businesses around the world that come together to support UN development goals and human rights and other initiatives. So the head of that is a man by the name of Y.W. Gennardi. And Alisa, maybe you know him. I don't know if you know him. But for many years, he was the head of a large corporation, a conglomerate in Indonesia. And he saw that a number of the employees were having difficulty coming to work. And he started to inquire, what's the problem? And he found out that they were having to stay home because their children didn't have proper health care, or they didn't have access to the health, and they had health needs. And so he said, well, what's the problem? And here, lo and behold, many of the children didn't have birth certificates because the parents never got married. And the parents never got married because of difficulties in getting married and the costliness of it. So the costliness comes when putting on a big wedding and inviting everyone and hiring a band and things like that. And then some of the bureaucratic difficulties were that they had to get a government certification for the marriage, as well as religious certification, and people, many families, couples just sort of common law got married and didn't really get all the paperwork. So then that was leaving their children outside the safety net. So that added to poverty, added to the lack of education. So Junardi, he himself is Catholic, and but of course most of the employees are Muslim, and then many Hindus. So he then started talking with folks and said, well, how can we solve this? And so the coming up from the people in the company, they said, well, we need to, if we'd get married, that would solve it, because then we'd get the birth certificates and then they're legitimate in the system. He said, well, let's do that. And then he started hosting together with the different faith communities, bringing the religious leaders together and the government people that can give the chop, saying you're married, and singers. And they came together, and 5,000 couples got married on one day. And then they would do it another time. And so he started these mass weddings so that they could solve this social problem. So it was something. So again, so when you think of business, here somebody motivated by his own faith and recognizing the religious dimensions of the problem was able to come in, work across faith lines, work with the government, and start to address this. And so, he's been, the government has also asked him to help, figure out bigger solutions to this, because you can only hold so many 5,000, couple weddings. That's a lot of work. But that was, such a beautiful example of what I'd like to make as the key point and get you to rethink about what the connection between faith and business is that businesses are filled with people of faith. So the majority of the world, and especially the majority of ASEAN countries' populations, are people of faith. So within companies, you have people of faith who are interested to live out their faith and its values and caring and loving their neighbor. And that becomes a powerful ally for development, just as an example that I gave with Junardi, and many other ways. So one of the other the last point I'll make in the opening comments is that working with the UN Global Compact, we give awards to business leaders who are advancing interfaith understanding, religious freedom, and peace through either their core business or through their social and philanthropic activities. And so Junardi was a winner. We've had other winners from ASEAN countries as well, who have been engaging to either use their business as a vehicle for promoting development and peace, or their philanthropic activities. So we had awards in every 2 years during the Paralympic Games. So we had them in Rio de Janeiro a few years ago, and then we had them in Seoul, Korea, with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, or the former Secretary General, being our keynote. And then we were supposed to have them this summer in Tokyo, but we'll be holding them next year in Tokyo when they hold the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo, or the Paralympics. So there's a whole network of these folks around the world. And just the last example I'll give, and it's not an ASEAN country, but it's an example of of how even the global business community can respond and can be touched by religious freedom issues, and what Catherine mentioned, some of the religious hostilities that flare up. So a few years ago, we had 2 years ago, we had three tragedies sort of close together. There was a shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in the United States, a massacre in a mosque in Christchurch in New Zealand, and then Easter church bombings in Sri Lanka. And different companies had employees, global companies had employees who were impacted by that. And one was Salesforce, which provides a lot of the back-end support for many NGOs, such as the Red Cross, World Vision, Islamic Relief. And they had some employees who were impacted in all three of those situations, either relatives or employees themselves. And so they began vigils for remembering the people, making the people feel that those lives weren't just lost in vain. And because they have a faith group within the corporation. And we're finding that many corporations and the top corporations have these employee groups that are motivated to support faith. And then within them, they respond to these kind of crises and raise awareness of the situations that people are facing. And then also companies like Salesforce helped to help get some of the supply chains to relieve some of those problems, especially in Sri Lanka. So again, thinking of business as an ally means thinking of the people within businesses who can be responsive and to some of these issues, and they can help steer resources or steer attention or provide know-how like Junardi did to say, let's just roll up our sleeves and tackle some issues. So with that, I'll give it back to Cole.
Thank you very much. I'm working on getting, when the next speaker starts, I will post on the chat the link to the YouTube, so you'll have that for later. But at this point, thanks to Brian. I think one of the things that has always really interested me about Brian's work is I remember many years ago having discussions with some other people about, how typically if you're working on international religious freedom, you work through the branches of foreign ministries that deal with human rights and so forth. And I had a friend at some point say, there's a tremendous amount of real power where a lot of foreign ministries really concentrate their efforts is on the business sector. And so part of what Brian is thinking about in creative ways is how the business sector can be tapped in non-manipulative ways, just taking into account genuine concerns that are there. And it's really remarkable the kind of creativity and the possibilities that can be found there. Well, let me turn now to Alisa Waheed. Thank you again for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Pak Cole. Sorry, this is rather hard for me to not use Pak or Bu Catherine and Pak Cole.
You're honored. We're honored.
Thank you also for SEAFoRB for organizing this webinar and also inviting me to share my thoughts with you all. Let me get straight to the point because this is just a prologue, right? So Asia, including ASEAN countries and ASEAN people, ASEAN societies, I think they are more of sociocentric societies where social identity and group norms, group belongingness are placed as important or more important than individual needs and rights. And I remember reading Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, which examine this extensively. And this is actually one point of contention, one point of should we say, acupressure points in terms of the contrast of this sociocentric society, which relies on social grouping, in contrast with the concept of democracy that relies on individual voices, individual rights, and individual needs, and also sometimes with human rights instruments also. If we're not careful and not taking this into consideration, we would lose like courage to continue the fight for a more democratic and more human rights based citizenship in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia. And we all know that religions also have several characteristics that is very much aligned with the sociocentric character of the Asian people. Like, for example, in religion, we have aspects of communality. Strong interactions between followers of certain religion. In Indonesia, we call it ukhuwah Islamiyah, the solidarity between the Muslims, that's ukhuwah Islamiyah, or ukhuwah Diniyah, the solidarity between people of the same religion. It's usually stronger because you worship the same God, and that is the most sacred relationship that you have with God and then with fellow religious followers. And then we also have strong relations. It's a bit power relations between the leadership of the organized religion and its followers, like pastor with their congregations or imam with their jama'ah. They have a very strong relationship. Again, because these religious leaders, they are representative of God. And we also have one characteristic of religion that is really strong, that which is about the value orientation within the religion itself. Like, for example, for the Catholic, it's compassion. For Muslim, we always say that Islam is rahmatan lil alamin, is the blessing for the universe. And so all Muslims should, this is the ideal, should fight for the benefit of the goodness, the common good of mankind, like that. But we all know that this characteristic, communality, strong camaraderie, powerful relations between leadership and followership, when put into a social political context, sometimes this characteristic lead to the kind of problems that Ibu Catherine have already explored with us. We have problems of religious exclusivism, superiority, discriminations, intolerance, and of course, even extremism and violent extremism. Time and time again, we have seen the horrific cases like just what we just witnessed in France, or just this last, I think this last month, the Gus Durian Peduli, this is the humanitarian wing of Gus Durian Network Indonesia. We have been assisting hundreds of Rohingya refugees stranded on the shore of Sumatra. We built toilets and shower rooms and makeshift places. And just a couple of weeks ago, we just sent 1 ton of rice for these people who are fleeing Myanmar because of the violations of their human rights. And we are seeing these challenges on the name of religions happening not only in Southeast Asia, of course, in all over the world. But in Indonesia, we observe that there is a rise in intolerance and discriminations based on religions. And from what I've seen, there are two key factors leading to this new trend. The first one is actually oversimplification of democracy into majority rules paradigm. So because of votings, people believe that as the majority who wins the election, then they are the ones that have to be given the space and the privilege to decide on the programs and policies, public policies. It seems like in this majority rules paradigm, there is no human rights perspective, or at least a minimum human rights perspective. And in Indonesia, this majoritarianism is amplified by decentralization of governments. So now the contention is at the local level, sub-district level, and Bu Catherine also mentioned about this. And the second factor is the unintended or unmanaged consequence of democratization and freedom of associations that bring the emergence of ultra-conservative religious groups, preaching religious exclusivism and extremism. For the last 20 years or so in Indonesia, these groups have transformed the Indonesian values. Just last week, one survey came out with alarming result. 63% of teachers in Indonesia have religious exclusivistic values. Most teachers would reject worship places of different religions in their areas of living. They would reject development of schools managed by different faith-based organizations, and even they're willing to sign petition against appointment of higher of education officials of education offices who are not from the same religion. And so this leads to discrimination based again on the religious exclusivistic ideas. So this is the challenge. But having said that, I have also come to realize that religions and faith-based organizations can be great resources of social change and development. The same characteristics of religion, but with the more empowering values and rights-based approaches, would bring much needed clarity and directions for society. In Indonesia, for example, faith-based organizations like Nahdlatul Ulama, Muhammadiyah, Bishop Conference of Indonesia for the Catholic churches, or Communion of Churches of Indonesia, this is for the Protestants, have shown the power they have in leading their members to contribute to society in many ways, especially in development. Large FBOs like the Catholic Church, Nahdlatul Ulama with its 80 million members, Muhammadiyah with 20 million members, we offer hundreds of thousands of schools and universities, health centers, hospitals, banking services, economic initiatives, and in educating public, general public, and numbers of and members on issues considered relevant to our own organizations. And of course, specific to our conversation today, most importantly, these faith-based organizations can help their followers and general public to foster interfaith cooperations to address development agendas, including Goal 16, of course, on peace and access to justice. And in Indonesia, the COVID-19 pandemic is a showcase of how interfaith communities are able to work hand in hand, spreading out services, especially in remote areas. And this social capital should be systematically mined and used to effect transformation. I remember the 3R approaches coined by Susan Walsh. She put a theory based on the work of USC Canada in Southern America, that sustainable change only happens if you have change in three dimensions: the dimensions of the grassroots level, the change in the grassroots level, the dynamics of the civil society organization, and the last one is the rights-based dimensions to the change. And sometimes in terms of freedom of religion, I see that there is what do you call it, a focus on advocacy and on public policies, but we don't. Not really, we don't. But the work at the grassroots level itself is not really connected to the faith-based organizations, just like Brian already told us before. And recognizing the power of the faith-based organizations would lead to working or engaging, like Ibu Catherine said, engaging in more effective ways with these faith-based organizations, capitalizing on their powers and influencing the people so that we can lead the transformation into a more religious, moderate practices like that. And of course, for this, it is imperative to have freedom of religions as the foundations of the developmental work. And I'm glad to report that the government of Indonesia have taken measures for this, tackling the rising religious exclusivism, engaging the faith-based organizations. Currently, in our national medium-term development plan, 2020 to 2024, we have put the religious moderation as one of the most strategic, one of the most important, the priority of the national strategy in building a society. And in terms of SDGs, the National Secretariat of the Indonesian SDGs engage FBOs in national team for each goal. So for other organizations, they are only engaged in certain goals, but for the faith-based organizations, big faith-based organizations, they invite representative for each national coordinating team. So the voices and the engagement is the voices of the religious group, and capitalizing on their reach out and their power is really put forth in Indonesia. And I hope to touch on this more later in our discussion, but in essence, freedom of religions would open up the widest doors to achieving the global development goals we are striving for. As my leader, President Waheed, used to say, the true role of religion is to awaken its followers to the fact that they are part of the human race and the universe. And with that, I conclude my opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think reminded us of some of the very important things that go into building a kind of common approach. And, you know, I was originally going to ask to what extent has religion been part of development agendas in ASEAN, but it's quite clear, it seems, that all of you are talking about the fact that this seems to be something that is coming. Maybe it would be worth just giving you a chance, each of you a chance to say, what are some of the things that you see as obstacles, and where are some of the most helpful opportunities in terms of where there can be engagement, where there can be productive synergies between religion and the public sphere. Maybe take that in the same order. Catherine?
Well, that's a tough question. And I prefer that the regional experts who know the current state of ASEAN much better than I do can take up the ASEAN issues. But I think that in trying to bring the religious dimension into discussions about development issues, whether it's economic models or debt issues or policies towards social protection or gender equality or any of the other issues that are part of what the 167 targets within the Sustainable Development Goals. I would argue there's a religious dimension in every single one of them, in, first of all, the sense that religious communities are actually involved in one way or another, including, with electric power and land tenure and you name it. But it's an extremely complicated world. And to take a Grimm statistic, we all talk about 84% of the world's population having some religious affiliation. I mean, that gives you a glimpse of the enormous complexity. And I think Alisa has been talking about one of the biggest obstacles, which is the sense, to me, the sense, first of all, that people who are religious don't believe in science and that they're extremists. In other words, equating religion with extremism. But frankly, I would also say equating religion with conservatism and unwillingness to change, to patriarchy, rigidities within society's traditional norms. And we see that in the United States, where there is, for many, when you say religion, they will immediately think holding back freedoms, being against human rights, etc. And of course, that's not true because you have some of the most exciting creative thinking that's happening within religious communities. So I think that that's where the religious literacy comes in, that if people approach this sensitive and complex topic with preconceptions and prejudices, that doesn't help in our task, Cole, of trying to persuade the G20 that the religious voices belong at the table, but also within ASEAN and within many governments. So moderation is one way to deal with it, though I think there are many people. I think, what is it? Madeleine Albright says she wants enthusiastic moderates, or I think she has an even better phrase, but basically we're not looking for boring moderation. We're looking for understanding, for openness, for curiosity, for wanting to understand the other. But I think that if this idea that religion stands for patriarchy and for extremism, we're lost in the effort that we're trying, and in the complex reality that we see and that we're trying to bring to the table.
So, well, let me give the other two of you a chance to comment on this. I mean, I think running through Alisa's comments was a sense of the importance of finding effective ways to engage. And Brian, your life story has been focused on figuring out creative ways. Are there things that, I guess for Alisa, are there things that are sort of distinctive to the region, maybe distinctive to specific countries that, for example, Indonesia is always one of the stereotypical images, is that it's one of the more tolerant, it's like the part of the tolerant periphery of Islam, I suppose you could say. But are there sort of distinctive things that make things easier? Are there things where we really can find very positive synergies? What are there specific examples that come to mind?
Okay, so what Ibu Catherine already talked about the prejudices of the religious people is and also the secular approach to things in the especially in the Western countries, they are not. It's a very different situations in at least in Indonesia, and I know in Malaysia, because the challenge would be to balance the intrusiveness of the religion, the religious groups in Indonesia. Like, for example, my father used to say that Indonesia is not a secular state, but it's also not a religious state. So neither here nor there, and that lead us to some sort of what is gamang in English, uncertainty even. And when we talk about religious moderation, Ibu Catherine, in Indonesia, religious moderation means there is a connection between religion and state, but at a more balanced way. So this is not too secular, not too liberal. Some people would say that, and not too religion-centered, like that. So this some sort of balance is actually, I would say, this is the distinctive feature of the Indonesian Muslim society, or the Indonesian religious groups in Indonesia, Paco, that the balance between identifying yourself as a religious person belonging to some religious group with identifying yourself as a citizen of a state is really strong, and it has been a classic doctrine by the religious leaders themselves in Indonesia. Like, for example, in NU, we operate by the doctrine of like this: as a Muslim, Indonesian Muslim, if I really want to uphold Islam rahmatan lil alamin, Islam as the blessing of the universe, then I have to take care of three solidarity at the same time. The first one is Ukhuwah Islamiyah, the solidarity between Muslims. The second one is Ukhuwah Watoniyah, the solidarity between Indonesian citizens, regardless of their beliefs and religion. And the third one is Ukhuwah Bashariyah, the solidarity across humanity, wherever they are. This is what we have been taught from when we are still young. So it's easier for us to actually put our place in like collaborating with citizens of Indonesia that belongs to Ukhuwah Watoniyah, and it's nothing to do with religion, like that. Now, so this is the long history of substantive inclusive practice of religion, which is now being challenged by the rise of the religious exclusivist kind of religious practices. And that's actually the obstacles that your initial question about the engagement and how to work effectively is this rise, the contention between, or the competition between the paradigm or practices, which is substantive inclusive versus the exclusivist formalistic practices of religion. That's actually the challenge in Indonesia.
So let me, I want to pick up on your third point about solidarity across humanity and maybe raise a question about an intermediate point about solidarity across ASEAN. Mm-hmm. One of the things that has always been striking to me about ASEAN is that I think this is true of all of the ASEAN countries. They have a predominant religion or worldview.
Yes.
That predominant religion or worldview is a minority in many, if not most, of the other countries.
Yes.
And on the one hand, you have ASEAN. Many of its goals are to bring about kind of unity that can foster development, economic success, all kinds of things like that. But there is this cross-ASEAN tension because co-religionists who are being persecuted in one country, that generates resentments in the majority of another country. It has political kickback, and that makes the solidarity across countries difficult. And I guess one of my questions is as an outsider, I've often thought that if you really had true religious respect for other people, and this were really instantiated, this would help lower the temperature on some of these conflicts. Now, I guess my question is, and that's both to others looking out, but also to you as sort of an insider in the region. Is it realistic to think that this can really make a transnational, international kind of difference? Are there real tensions here that sort of an internationalized standard could help with, or are the issues just too local and too embedded? I don't know. I don't know how you see it, Alisa. I don't know how you see it, Catherine. I don't know how you've watched these things, Brian, sociologically and statistically. But is at a sort of macro level within ASEAN, are the efforts toward FORB really going to help wield this whole area together in stronger ways? I'm not sure who to start with. But maybe I'll let you go because you're in the region. I'm giving you time.
Okay.
Things in a row.
Okay. Yeah. So the sociocentric characteristic of the Asian societies, I think that also reflect on how the ASEAN states interact with one another, because they put social harmony at the top of their values. So instead of confronting on the foundations of international instruments, the way I see the states' interaction is actually, let's keep the social harmony. And this is I think what frustrates most of us in the human rights movement, especially in the civil society movement, is this positioning or this hierarchy of values itself within the ASEAN states, and of course, we have the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. We have the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. We have many instruments already in place. I think by 2018, 2019, much effort was actually developed and implemented to equip the state actors on these issues, but I don't think we are at the state. By we, I mean the civil society organizations. We are at state where we can say comfortably that these human rights issues, especially freedom of religion issues, are response. Get the response needed from the Asian state at the regional level, at the ASEAN level. So we are still hoping that it would be more progressive. We have more and more members of parliament who are engaged through the HR, sorry, and there is Para Fendi Jamin here. I think he can talk more. If it's possible, then we can ask him also to talk about this. But as a representative from civil society movement, we're still not in a comfortable place, I would say, in regards to how the ASEAN state respond to this issue of freedom of religion and belief in ASEAN.
Okay, let's see.
Yeah.
I don't know if Catherine or Brian, if you have something to.
Yeah, I can jump in, then I'm sure Brian has a lot to say as well. But one thing that I think is interesting to ask about, and we're certainly talking about it a lot in the United States this week, is leadership and the models of leadership. So I think that that's clearly an interesting question as to how far strong and committed and principled leadership might make a difference.
Yeah.
The second question, and certainly we're seeing this in some countries, is the equation of identity with nationalism. And sort of people, I heard in the meeting last week, people were not talking about countering violent extremism, but countering extreme nationalism or violent nationalism, which is sort of a new formulation. But it is, I think, an interesting and important issue that as soon as people's identity starts linking, and you have several countries that have really quite consciously done this, in contrast to Indonesia, which is really founded on a plural model, an inclusive, less inclusive, but more plural model of society. The other thing that I don't think we've mentioned very much, but which is obviously, particularly for the long term, absolutely critical, is education and the ways in which the education system, and Alisa, the comments you made about the teachers are quite frightening. That's what 63% of teachers are falling into these categories of intolerance. Now, you do have some models within ASEAN, particularly Singapore, which is sort of if you ask people what's the best model of an education system in the world that's really dealing proactively with issues of inclusion and really understanding the other, Singapore comes up. I think Indonesia has some very interesting initiatives that are happening, and there are some in other countries. But I think focusing, there are a number of questions coming through in the Q&A about all this is very well and good, but how do you translate it into action? Well, clearly one place to translate things into action is through the education systems, because there are established and relatively high quality education systems in the region. And that, I think, it may be the best place to start.
Brian, would you like to?
Yeah, if I can jump on that sort of a practical way that things are done, I'll share my screen again if I'm successful. Try to do that. So you should be able to see a PowerPoint there. And just as an example of how this works and how business can be a powerful ally in this, I take it from Dell, and I mentioned them a little bit earlier. This is the mission statement of the employee group at Dell, which is spread over dozens of countries. This is their mission. Our faith is reflected in the work we do, the markets we serve, and the talent we attract. Remember, this is Dell Computer talking. Faith is central to our authentic self. It impacts our thoughts, actions, and daily life. Representing many faiths, we are one interfaith family, open to all faiths, always. Our mission is to drive awareness, promote understanding, and foster camaraderie within our workplace and communities. We find strength in our differences and are better together. I mean, who could imagine that as a statement coming from a major Fortune 500 company? And I just want to show a couple examples of how they're putting that to practice in ways that any company in ASEAN could do. And I'd be glad to help any of them, have an understanding of how this is done. So here, one of the first projects, just to give you an idea, within the company, they have interfaith executive sponsor, that's a senior vice president of the company. And then they have global interfaith leads. And then they have a whole structure underneath with finance and events and professional development. I mean, these are well-developed organizations of faith within major companies. And then under that, they have faith-specific groups that work together: Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, and others if they want to form. So I'm sure it's the first time for you to see something like this in a corporation. So what do they do? One of the things that they did, they held a global initiative to focus on freeing women from human trafficking. And they had 3 live events. They had 1,700 participants, 48 watch parties. They raised thousands of dollars. They spread this over 29 countries. And so it was coming from the faith group saying, we need to do something. And they brought all the other groups, the women's groups, the other groups in Dell technology to work on this. So, whatever the issue is, coming up from within corporations, if employees are allowed to organize and do this, they can push these resources. And I'll just give you a couple other shots from within Dell. They produce interfaith fact cards for each of the faith groups so that you can see what does it mean to be a Jewish person, what are their main holidays, and then how can we best support people of the Jewish faith in the workplace. And then they have a card like that for Hindus, for Muslims, for Christians, and for Buddhists, and so forth. So, you can't get any more practical than that. It's just such an amazing model that I'm seeing. I'm trying to stop sharing my screen here. There we go. So it's just an amazing model of what's possible when you think outside the boxes. So again, inside these companies, it's just practical. It's nothing that it doesn't necessarily have to cost any money, but you just have to help businesses see how this is done. And I know in Indonesia, for example, this kind of approach within the workplace could be very successful. And then it just spills out outside of the company into society. So, this is something very hopeful that's going on. And I think something that the companies across the ASEAN region could take, because just like you said, Cole, each one of these faiths that as mentioned, is a minority somewhere else. And so that means that there are followers of these different faiths in each of the countries, and they could provide that interfaith understanding within their own company, which then makes them competitive to do business. So if you're a Buddhist and if you're in Vietnam trying to do business with Indonesia and you don't know anything about Islam, it's going to be a lot harder to do business. But the same if you're in Indonesia and you're a Muslim and you don't know much about Buddhism, it's going to be hard to do business in Thailand or Vietnam. So these interfaith groups within companies not only have this sort of social good, but also there's a lot of business benefit.
Yeah, I think one of the things that brings out is that the stereotypical image is that people don't want to touch religion because they're worried that it will sort of open a can of worms, as it were, that will trigger all kinds of tension. But the interesting thing about the Intel example, and there's a lot of data on.
It was the Dell. It was from Dell.
But it actually is very helpful to the work environment because it makes people feel more secure, more accepted, it diffuses tensions in advance. And so that's a very helpful notion. Now, I have to thank our speakers because they've been paying attention to the questions that have been coming in, and some of them have been addressed quite directly. But maybe it would be worth, since we're here obviously because of the COVID thing, that is, we're online rather than meeting in person somewhere. One of the questions that came in is, what is the role of religious leaders in leading or inspiring the society facing with current and post-COVID-19 challenges? And maybe it's worth thinking, there was an announcement today of one of the major pharmacy companies has a vaccine that's 90% effective. It's got to go through more tests, of course, but that's very encouraging. But maybe each of you, maybe I turn to Catherine first, because I know you've done a lot of work on thinking about the kind of role that religious leaders and other actors can play in dealing with the COVID. And that is a concrete example that can then replicate across other SDGs.
By most analysts, the next critical step in moving out of the COVID emergencies is an effective vaccine that is accepted by large percentages of populations and that is distributed equitably. And I think you can make a good case that without having religious engagement, that cannot happen. And that's for various reasons. One, of course, is that trust is a major issue in people accepting the vaccine. And religious leaders, even though there's been erosion in indices of trust, they rank much higher, certainly, than politicians or most NGOs. And I'm sorry, Brian, but business as well. So the fact that religious communities and leaders are trusted is important. But the other is that there is so much misinformation around that really needs to be countered within religious communities. In other words, if there is a Pentecostal, an evangelical group that is very skeptical, it's probably evangelical leaders who are better able to address and to deal with that. And then there are very complex ethical issues involved in who should get the vaccine first. And I think we're safe in saying that religious leaders may not always be the most ethical, but they certainly think about it a lot more, and they articulate it. And I think I certainly was disappointed with Biden's announced task force that there's no religious element in it. It's purely science. And clearly it needs to go beyond science in order to have the kind of the ethical dimension, which countries, which communities are first. And that's true in testing as well as in rollout. But also in persuading communities that this is something that is necessary, the kind of social cohesion that we're all looking for.
So either Alisa or Brian, would you like to add to that?
I'm part of a group called COVID X Now. And it was set up by a number of some business women from Texas. And then they reached out to me to help bring some faith perspective to that. So I think one of the, at least one of the lessons I've learned in that group is that it's valuable to step outside of where you think you can offer value. Just because I'm not a doctor, I don't have supply chains and things like that. But by my participation in that group, then I was able to network different companies together on these employee resource groups, because of, just for example, American Airlines and all the airlines have had to cut half of their staff. And if you're not somebody who's being cut, that just sounds like a statistic. But within the companies, that means people's livelihoods are gone. And so since I work with a number of these people, people that I've been working with for some years, they're now no longer there, like at some of the airlines. So the faith groups within them started to act as chaplains to help people who were losing their jobs. So it may not always be evident of what what I can do. Not that I did that. I can't say I did that much, but just engaging and bringing whatever my background and the faith communities I work with was one way of dealing with COVID. So I think we don't have to always be creating the vaccine or solving those big problems. Sometimes we can engage in meaningful ways that help people at a more local, personal level.
So I'm watching the time wind down. One thing I would like to do, and maybe just to make sure we don't lose the moment, this is to give Eugene just a moment to talk about what is happening next week. It connects in to some ways here because we're talking about some of the inclusion issues and so forth. But Eugene, if you wouldn't mind, just take a moment or two to tell people about what's coming next.
Yes, thank you, Cole, and thank you, everybody. Welcome, everybody. I'm not supposed to be on the panel, but I'll just make a comment or two, and perhaps some further questions from the local context of Southeast Asia for us to just interact with it as we close this session. Firstly, next week we are going to dwell and address, or at least attempt to address, a more specific issue, and that is in relation to religion or freedom of religion in relation to SDG 60, goal number 16, and that is on the issue of inclusive society in peace and harmony. That's somewhat dealt with what Catherine has painted in a very broad stroke. And Alisa has actually brought in more the regional concerns in the context of Indonesia. So next week, we are going to explore a little bit more in depth into this particular issue. The question of religious moderation, how it plays a part in the so-called debate between human rights and social harmony. And is there such a thing as a balance? And if it's a balance, can we even balance it? And or do we need to even contextualize it further to the local communities? Because as it stands, civil society language has one language and they speak that language. But if you know the many local communities within the Southeast Asia regions, they are not very literate, and their language and how they communicate and how they understand and how they internalize values are very different from the civil society level. So the question here is, how do we bring all that down to the local grassroots community? Because it is the local grassroots communities that can spur the inclusive agenda, but it can also veer towards what you call a more extremist kind of social practice, livelihood, lifestyle. So that's what we're going to do next week as we attempt to unpack some of this issue more specific to the region. But just a few questions for our panelists, since I'm invited by Cole to sit in with this distinguished panelist. Catherine, my question is a very simple one. I note what you say, and I completely agree with you that within the SDGs, there are about 150 targets and so on. And it's enlightening that you say that you can think of religion being part of any of these targets. So I think one of the struggles that we do have is that while the civil society, for want of a better word, quote unquote, the secular groups, they wholeheartedly embrace the SDG goals and the targets and the specific targets. But in my experience interacting with them, they don't see religion as part of it. They don't see the question of spirituality as part of it, as part of this. They just want to focus purely on the target, the infrastructure. How do we eradicate poverty? How do we improve the environment, for example? But we really don't see, they don't really see the spiritual aspect, the values, the religious aspect as part of it. In fact, they say that we don't want to talk about religion in part of this SDGs or this target because religion divides. Religion divides. So something for you to address. Brian, thank you very much for your very good example of, from Dell. I'm going to go back to some of my corporates here and tell them that's what actually you should do, because we do have the issue of discrimination with some of our Muslims in some of these multinationals or bigger corporations, such as, for example, no prayer time. Well, a very common example. But my question to you is this: as I interact with the corporates also have this mentality. Something like what I'm posing the question to Catherine is this: let's not talk about religion here. It's a sensitive issue, it's very sensitive, our CEOs and our shareholders doesn't like to talk about it because race and religion is not a good thing in Malaysia. So we have this struggle with the corporates. So that's something that perhaps both of you can help to address and maybe enlighten us from the audience. A very practical example as we face it here in the context of Southeast Asia. Religion is basically taboo. Let us not dwell into it. Let us talk about what unites rather than what divides. Any comments? Thank you.
Well, we could work on this one for another hour and a half. My general sense is that as we've been working, I've been working now for 20 years in this very specific effort to bring closer together the religious communities and the non-religious communities. I don't want to call them secular because that's such a tricky word, but there are some real divisions. And quite often you will find, for example, civil society communities which don't have religion in them, which is ridiculous. But it's partly that religious communities are so much larger than NGOs. But more specifically, within the religious freedom communities, you have the human rights communities often have not focused very specifically on the religious dimensions, whereas the religious freedom advocates have, I think, taken a view of putting, saying it's the first freedom, it's above all else. So I think that they're bringing these communities together. Another set of communities that are very divided are religious women who are inspired by religion, and feminists, which again, these are communities that have common interests that really should be working together, but that tend to be at each other's throats in the most extreme circumstances. So finding ways to bring these communities together, often around very practical questions or practical issues, I think is the strategic way to try to move beyond these divisions. So you asked me another question, which I've now dropped, but since we're almost out of time, maybe I'll just pass it to Brian.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, like Catherine said, we could go another hour and a half on this. Just in sort of one sentence, the way that this has been successful in so many corporations is that they focus on the celebration of the faith identity and what building that can do to help build up the company. So, and then they say, okay, certain things are off limits, like proselytizing or dogma, focusing on theological debates. So they've set good ground rules. So it's not like you just open the door and say everything goes. I mean, I'm happy to follow up more if you really want to see how to get this into some companies, because you know, there are things you have to do to make it work, and if you don't do them, it can be, you know, it can backfire.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
I am conscious that we're sort of at the end of the time. I wanted to.
Pak Paul, is it?
Yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead. Yes, but I do want to give people final statements. Yeah, so go ahead, Alisa.
No, actually, I wanted to comment response on Brian's example of the 5,000 marriage certification thing. I remember I was with a person from the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and I plan to help him meet with people from the Global Compact, and then the person from the Global Compact Indonesia told us the story about the certification thing, and then the official from the Ministry of Religious Affairs said that, oh, be careful. Be careful. You need to really understand the consequences of your intervention. Why? Because in Indonesia, there are many religious leaders, Muslim leaders, who think, who put religions as higher than the legal, legal framework. And because of these facilitations on certification of marriage after they have children, these religious leaders, they then support marriage outside of legalizations in Indonesia, because they know that there are initiatives by the private sectors to facilitate. So this is what these religious leaders say. Just get married. What is most important is the blessing of God. And remember, there are many ways for you all to get the certification later. So I would just want to say that the private sectors, the business sectors would probably need to make sure that their interventions or their initiatives in terms of religions, in bringing religions in their work, by supervision, or probably have a consultative things with religious leaders first.
Well, that may be one of the really practical things. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, so yeah, just briefly, they worked with the religious leaders to have the religious wedding first at these events, and then after they were married religiously, then they did the certification. So they did work with religious leaders in those ceremonies to make it religious first, and then the certification afterwards.
The certification.
Yeah.
Well, I think that shows that we are wise enough to know that there are real complexities here, but that talking to each other may help get past some of them, and people who are operating in good faith, dealing with complexities, may, not always, but may be able to solve a number of issues. I think that's one of the messages that's running through this, is that there is a growing recognition on the part in the development world that there's so many of the development objectives that can't be really met without religion. I was struck reading the annual report from the UN Special Rapporteur that was just published a few weeks ago, how what the message of that report in effect was governments have an obligation to advance the SDGs, and interestingly, to the extent they don't do it, it's often a violation of FORB itself, because the people left behind are the religious minorities. On the other hand, better FORB can also help, and the religious groups can help find ways to get further on many of these goals, but it requires working together. Well, believe me, it's not just another hour and a half we could take. I think Catherine's life story suggests that it's at a minimum 20 years. Mine is more like 40. So these are issues that are not going to go away, but they are so critical. They make so much difference for people, for religious groups, and there are ways that we can find to make things better, and to that's one of the lessons, maybe one of the lessons coming out of COVID, that it's really imperative that we find better ways to engage and work together. So thank you very much. We put up on the screen that looks like there are some links to some of the things that Brian Grimm has been talking about. We put up a link to where you can get the YouTube videos if you want to look at these things again. And again, thank you so much. We look forward. Many of us really have a great love for this region, even though we can't claim citizenship in the region. I guess we're part of that, the solidarity that's global. So we appreciate your letting us participate with you. And with that, we'll end this session. Thank you so much to our panelists and to everyone else. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you to all.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
All right.
Yes.
Hope to
All
see
right.
you next week. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.